Well, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Welcome to the latest IAM webinar, IAM North America, so that is the Canadian and the US chapters jointly welcoming you today. Today's topic is modeling risk for decision making, as you well know. And Stan, if you want to click on the slides. Today's hosts for this webinar, we have Tom Smith, who is a vice president of the of the US chapter, I should say. He's from the University of Wisconsin, and he is also a member of the US delegation at ISO TC 251, which is the ISO committee managing the ISO 55000 series. And myself, Baudouin Nayens, I'm with Copperleaf in Vancouver, Canada. I'm a board member both of the IAM Canada and of the IAM mothership, and I'm also, as Tom, representing, in my case, Canada, of course, at ISO. So both of us will be collecting questions as we make progress, and we will be firing those questions at Stan at two occasions. Like halfway through, we'll make a little stop and we'll ask Stan a few questions, and then towards the end of the hour, we will, of course, have more questions, I'm sure, for Stan. If we don't get through all the questions, we will answer them through email after the session, after today's session. So today, Stan, if you want to click again, today is really part two of a series. Last year in August, we talked about modeling and asset management with Stan, and by popular demand, Stan is back, this time with a slightly more specific topic, namely how to model risk in the context of asset management and of decision making. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stan, and let's hear what the story is.
Hi, everyone. So my name's Stan Coleman. I'm the CTO at Copperleaf, and I hope everyone's doing well today. So as Baudouin mentioned, we'll have two breaks for questions. In the first part, I'm going to talk specifically around asset failure risks. And then in the second part, we'll talk about other kinds of risks and monetizing risks. So I've bolded the word realistically. So today's discussions on how to realistically model risks used in decision making. And in my 11 years at Copperleaf, I've been involved in assessing risks for many industries: electrical generation, transmission, distribution, gas transmission, distribution, water, rail. And this is actually from about 4 or 5 years ago. It was an event I remember well. This was a client of ours who had been in the process of implementing what we call a value framework and putting all of their business cases for all their investments and doing quantitative risk analysis of all those. And this was from the person who was responsible for bringing all of these risk assessments together and comparing them. And you know, what he noticed was that if he were to actually believe all the risk assessments, then in their organization there would have been literally dozens of people dying every day. And this was a reflection of people not really realistically assessing risks. And so I thought it was a suitable introduction for today. I mean, this organization was very safety conscious and had an excellent safety record, but their risk assessments didn't indicate that. So I thought also I'd start with something which I've titled A Uniquely Canadian Story. This happened a month or two ago. There's a town in northern BC called Tumbler Ridge, which has about 1,000 residents. And there was a big asset failure event that hit the news. So what happened was a beaver actually was building a dam, and that beaver dug 1 meter into the ground and severed a 4.5-inch conduit and the cables, and that knocked out basically internet, television, cell communications to the entire town for 36 hours. And actually, if you look at the picture at the left, you can see the conduit that was severed by the beaver. And the picture on the right was actually the dam they were constructing. And They were using the cable material to help build a better dam. And in fact, even if you look in the lower left corner, you can see the warning sign that told you there's a communications cable here. And it was even used to help build the dam. So I just threw this in as a humorous example. I'll come back to why this is relevant in terms of realistically assessing asset failure risks. So I'm going to start out really simple. Risk is the probability of an event occurring multiplied by the consequence of that occurring. And in my incredibly simple example starting point, we have an asset. We know that there's a 10% chance of that failing in the next year. And we know that if that asset fails, that it's going to take me a day to replace that asset. That will disrupt my business, and that'll cost me $1 million. And so I can easily compute that my risk for next year is 10% of $100 million, 10% of $1 million, so $100,000. Easy enough, but life isn't that simple. So I'm going to use a car example because just about everyone's familiar with cars. So the first thing is, I said there was a 10% chance of failure, but what failure mode was I talking about? If you think about a car, there's all kinds of failure modes. A windshield could break, the engine could seize up, the transmission could stop operating, or I could have a problem with my tires. And those are all different failure modes. And even if you talk about a single failure mode, like let's ignore all the other parts of the car and just talk about the tire, even with a single failure mode, there can be all kinds of different consequences from that. So say I have a slow leak on my tire, and say I'm conscientious and before driving every day, I check my tire pressure. Well, the consequence of that slow leak will be very minor. I'll detect that there's a leak. I'll get that leak repaired and nothing will go wrong. But if I'm less conscientious, I won't detect the leak. I'll run my tires on low pressure. I'll waste gas by doing that. I'll potentially damage the rim of the tire. Or even worse, perhaps, I don't detect the leak. That causes me to have less stability driving, and I end up in a crash which potentially could injure or even kill people. So, it's clearly getting far more elaborate now. And the next problem is, I said, well, there's a 10% of this failure occurring next year, but how do we know those probabilities? Now, in the case of cars, since there's hundreds of millions of them out there, we probably do know quite accurately the probabilities of failures. But when you have a smaller population of assets, those probabilities are harder to come by. And consequences. So in this example, I talked about, there's financial costs, there's lost time. I have to take my car to the garage to get it fixed. There's potentially safety issues. How do I calculate all those consequences? And everything changes over time. My tires age and wear over time. My use of the car might change over time, and even the environment I'm operating in could change over time. If my neighbors do a bunch of renovation on their house, that might increase the probability of me getting a tire puncture. So we're going to now go from our simple example and talk about how we deal with all these complexities. So step one, let's complicate our example and talk about multiple failure modes. So I start with an asset. I said we had an asset with a 10% chance of failing in the next year. But there's really two potential failure modes. There's a 50% chance that it will just trip a circuit and I'll be back in 1 hour, have it back online. And there's a 50% chance that I'll actually have to replace it and it'll take me 24 hours to do that replacement. So if I have it back online in an hour, then that's a $10,000 impact to my business. But if I have a one-day disruption, that costs me $1 million. So again, in this relatively simple example, how do we deal with that? Well, instead of taking the 10% chance of failure, I have to multiply that 10% chance of failure by the 50% chance that I'll actually have this consequence. And I have to multiply the 10% by a 50% chance that I'll have this consequence. So my risk now from a 1 hour disruption is half of 10% times that $10,000 consequence. And my risk from a 1 day disruption is half of 10% times $1 million. And then my total risk is the sum of those. And again, the last bullet here is emphasizing that you can only add all these things together if the events are mutually exclusive. So, which I made sure was the case here by, I didn't just take my chance of failure and say, oh, there's a 10% chance and I could have $1 million risk and a 10% chance I could have a 10,000, add those together. I have to make sure that I'm making those events exclusive of one another. So let's take that to from a theoretical example to a more realistic example. So I'm talking here about a transformer failure. So this is what we would call a catastrophic failure. So a failure where the transformers failed so badly that it needs to be replaced. Now, when that happens, there's many consequences, and many potential consequences. The first consequence is, this is a catastrophic failure of the transformer. I'll have to replace that transformer, and there's a replacement cost. But what if that transformer fails? So this transformer, we're assuming, is in a network where there's redundancy. So typically, if it fails, there'll be no loss of service to clients. But what if it fails? Well, some other equipment is out for maintenance. Well, then there will be a loss of service to customers. Sometimes when transformers fail, you get oil leaks. And then a consequence of that would be cleanup and any remediation costs associated with the spill. Sometimes when a transformer fails, you get fires, which can lead to damage of nearby equipment. And then our consequence is replacement of that nearby equipment. Sometimes those fires can lead to explosions. And then you've got much more equipment out, you damage nearby equipment, you have further reliability issues, and even worse, if an explosion occurs and there's someone in the vicinity, that could result in serious injury or fatality. So you can see now there's actually, even within this single failure mode, there's all kinds of consequences that could happen. And this slide is how not to model risks. This is how you end up with, call it severe overestimation of risks. So for a transformer at the end of its design life, we might actually know quite accurately the probability of its failing in any given year. And so for this example, I've said 3%. But I listed all those consequences. And so we could say, well, I'm going to take my probability and I'm going to include the replacement cost of the transformer. I'm going to include reliability costs associated with clients being out of service, the cost of the cleanup of an oil spill, the repairs from the fire, and the fatality caused by the explosion. And if you were to just add all those up and multiply those by 3%, you'd actually end up with quite an overestimate of the actual risk. So So what I've constructed here is a table to show how you deal with these different consequences. And what I've done is, again, we're talking about a single failure mode, this transformer failure. And the probability of that transformer failing is always 3%. But I've added another column here, which is the probability of consequence if that failure occurs. And so, looking at the first line, if the transformer fails, there's a 100% chance, there's a 100% chance we'll have to replace the transformer. So our probability of consequence is 1 or 100%. And so there's a 3% chance we will have to pay the replacement cost. But for all these other consequences, you can see we're not certainly going to have to do that. So, and I've just made up numbers here to make the math really simple so we can just move the decimal point. But so for example, we may get a loss of service to customers, but most of the time we won't. So we actually have to estimate what's the likelihood that if this transformer were to fail, that there would be other equipment out for maintenance or had failed itself. And so we have to estimate that. And in this example, I've just estimated that at 10%. So now our probability of actually having loss of service to customers is the 3% times the 10%. So it's a much lower number. And, you know, this goes on for all these different consequences. When a transformer fails, sometimes there's oil leaks, not always. Sometimes a fire could be ignited. And as we get to these examples down here, you can see how these probabilities multiply by each other, because we have a 3% chance that a transformer will fail. We have a 1% chance that it will actually ignite a fire. And then if a fire was ignited, there's another 1% chance that will actually lead to an explosion. And so you can see you end up with, you know, very small probabilities of consequence. Now, that doesn't make them irrelevant or insignificant necessarily, because these consequences get quite huge. So you get small probabilities times fairly large consequences. So, but they can result in fairly meaningful numbers. And so now, if I want to know the total risk I'm exposed to, I need to take each of these probabilities multiplied by each of these consequences, and I need to add all of these up together, and that's my total risk. So I've talked about different failure modes and different consequences associated with each failure mode, but let's move on to the probability side. Again, my simple example was I knew somehow that my chance of failure in the next year is 10%. And ideally, we use historic data to estimate probabilities of failure. I guess I've seen as a couple challenges with that. First, when looking at historic data, failure modes are often not available, and you know, and especially typically the further back you go, perhaps the harder it is to find such information. But sometimes it's just known that some asset failed. It's not known actually the reason, and in fact, often all we really know is that assets got replaced, and we don't even know in historic data if that resulted from an actual failure of the asset or if someone was concerned about it and proactively replaced it. And that can lead to, if that isn't clear, that can lead to an overestimate of failure rates if you don't somehow have a way of factoring those out. The other thing is that you know, as your data permits and as possible, you want to select an appropriate peer group. So, you know, just sticking to transformers, you might have transformers of different sizes, of different design types, different manufacturers, different eras. And if you were to just lump those all together, you would get some overall average of a probability of failure, but that might not be, you know, you might have certain manufacturer that has a way higher likelihood, or a certain design type, or certain sizes that have way higher or way lower ones. So where possible, you want to be using data that's, you know, as appropriate, obviously, for the particular assets you're looking at. Now, sometimes you just don't have significant historic data. And so what we've done with clients in the past is estimated failure rates based on design life of equipment, and using some sort of standard failure curves. Again, this is not the ideal way to do it. It's way better to base it on either your own historical data or historical data collected across groups of like usages, but it's definitely better than having nothing, and better than having no estimate, because we all know things do actually have some probability of failing. And then I spoke about, you know, I made the problem more complicated. So first, in terms of not only do we have to estimate these probabilities of failure, we actually have to estimate too, well, when they fail, what are the chances these consequences will occur? And that makes having historical data even more difficult, but because often there just aren't that many examples. But it's certainly, what I've found and seen is that it's certainly almost always possible to get in the right order of magnitude. You know, again, like having some estimate of, like, rather than just assuming every transformer failure leads to a fire, you probably can look back and say, well, they don't all. We have a lot that didn't, and you can at least get something in the right ballpark, which is clearly way better than making like a grossly incorrect assumption. And the last complication we want to deal with here is that once we understand all our probabilities, once we understand our different failure modes, our consequences, the probability of those consequences occurring, we have to recognize that, at least for some kinds of asset failures, that these aren't constants over time. I mean, the most obvious one is typically assets, failure rates climb as the assets age. We also, though, as we deal with climate change, there are events where, you know, perhaps historical values for those aren't good predictors of future values. We'll talk about this a little more in the next part, about basically market influences on price changes, and even your utilization of your assets might be changing, and the utilization of your assets could result in different failure rates and different consequences. So with that, we'll take a few minutes and see if we have any questions.
We do. First question for you, Stan, is do you include mitigation factors in the risk calculation?
Do you include mitigation factors in the risk calculation? So, absolutely. I probably should have put something in the slides about that. Different mitigation strategies will have different success rates at mitigating risks. And I'll talk about that a little more when we talk about external risks, because that's exactly where it often comes into play, that a certain mitigation will only impact certain failure modes. So you have to consider that, absolutely.
Excellent. Speaking of failure modes, how would you describe mutually exclusive? This is Tosin here, and he says, my thoughts are the different consequences on the transformer are not mutually exclusive. I would really benefit from more clarity here.
They're not, yeah. I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. So that is true. That's exactly true. Those different consequences were not mutually exclusive, but you do have to add them together. And why that is because they can both occur, both like whether, like just bringing back to the transformer example, you know, the transformer can leak and it could also explode. So you have to add both those consequences in. Now, the situation I was trying to make sure you avoid is where your two events are mutually exclusive. You have to make sure that you multiply them by the probability of each one of them happening. So I probably didn't word that slide perfectly, but hopefully that clarification is clear, that yes, that if you can have multiple consequences, that aren't mutually exclusive, you have to count all of them. But if you have events that are mutually exclusive, you have to only count each one. I've probably just made that worse.
Next question, which should be easier, is what is the difference between the probability of a consequence and the consequence severity level?
Right. So we're going to talk about in the next part monetizing the consequences. So in this part, I left the consequences just as verbal descriptions. So the difference is, and if we use a financial example, it's simple. So if I have, if I'm going to lose $1 million, that's a consequence. But the probability of consequence is that event going to happen as a result of this failure mode? I mean, I'll make up a brand new example here. If I leave my front door open, that's a failure mode, and I have a safe. There's $1 million in my safe. Well, I wish there was, but there isn't. The fact I left my door open, what's the probability now that someone will wander in and be capable of opening my safe? So I would call that probability the probability of the consequence. I would call the consequence the $1 million that I'll lose if someone gets into that safe.
I want to go and visit your safe. So
right.
How do you model risk inflation over time, say over 30, 40, 50 years, in a do nothing versus a mitigation scenario? That might be for your second part too. I don't know. Like maybe you're going to talk about that.
No, it's actually, I didn't cover that explicitly. That is a good question. How do you model inflation over time? So what we do is we do incorporate the impact of inflation. So we consider inflated values, but then we present value everything back to the current date. Is that?
I assume that is the answer. I mean, it says, how do you model risk inflation over time? So risk, of course, will grow over time just by degradation, etc., as you mentioned earlier. But then, indeed, there is the inflation aspect, which is applied to the consequences, I guess, which would be what you were describing.
Right.
Okay, hold on. My mouse jumped around here, so I need to kind of catch up with where I'm really at. Yes, failure patterns, they vary by class. They could be bathtub, random, etc. So how can you determine the PF interval based on the different patterns? So this is more, we're into a hardcore failure mode determination now. I think it's back to your tire example there.
Go ahead.
I think it jumps to me like it's the inspection intervals, etc., that you're talking about here, right? Like to determine how your PF interval will be determined.
Yeah, I mean, if you have historic, I assume this in the context of having some historical data that that data would show some kind of curve. You might use intuition when you're matching the data. So you might assume a certain curve shape. Like if you have strong reasons to believe there should be a certain curve shape, then you would use that in fitting the data and creating a curve. Because obviously when you have historical data, it doesn't form a perfect curve, and you create some idealized shape from that. And you would probably factor in an assumption as to what you would expect that shape to look like when you do that curve fitting.
All right. I'm going to ask you one last question, and then I assume it's time to move on, because otherwise we're going to have a risk of failure at the end of the hour. So we've come across organizations that add their probability of failure to their consequence of failure. So for instance, if you have a scale of 1 to 5 for POF and a scale of 1 to 5 for COF, rather than resulting in a score from 1 to 25, it'd be a score from 2 to 10. How would you rate that approach?
So it can work, provided your scales are logarithmic. If your 1 to 5 scale is a logarithmic scale for both probability and consequence, then you can add probability and consequence together, because if you think way back to math, that's how logarithms work, that you can add the logs of numbers together. So that actually can work, provided your scales are logarithmically defined.
Right. But I assume that if it's a scale from 1 to 5, likely they're linear scales, and then it doesn't work.
Then it doesn't work at all. That's correct. That would radically overestimate the risk for low probability and consequence events.
Excellent. Tom, anything that you want to kind of add before we move on?
No, I think those are great questions, and Stan, you're doing a wonderful job fielding them. I think the only thing I would say is that the curves, the theoretical curves, I mean, the answer there is it's a great risk to just grab one of those and assume that it's reality, unless you have some data. And in the real world, most systems have, even if the curves were correct, there are multiple failure modes for any real system. So you would have multiple curves to combine.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, Stan, over to you again. I'm going to disappear off screen.
Okay. So in the first part, we were talking primarily about or thinking primarily about like mechanical or electrical failures of the assets themselves. But and this comes back to one of the questions about mitigations. For many assets, the most important failure modes may be from external forces. So for natural gas distribution, one of the most significant failure modes is people inadvertently digging into their lines. For equipment located along the sides of roads like poles, one of the most significant failure modes is people driving into those poles. And so this is where looking at, this is where the mitigations for those are going to be quite different. You know, replacing a gas line with a brand new gas line doesn't change the likelihood of someone digging into it. You have to use different mitigations to address those risks. But the underlying methodology for evaluating the risk remains the same, in the sense that, you know, you're looking at what's the probability of the event and what's the consequence. And ideally, again, you're looking at historical data to help assess that, like how frequently do people dig through, you know, rupture lines. The sabotage, and when I talk about sabotage, I'm talking about either physical sabotage or cybersecurity. Again, the underlying methodology for analyzing these risks remains the same. And in fact, we've recently been developing some cybersecurity models for our Copperleaf Value Model Library. And I would say a couple things through the development of those, a couple observations. So first, just like I've been talking about for other risks, there's a tendency or a risk when estimating risk of overestimating the risk based on assuming that any breach will result in the worst possible outcome. So again, it's just like our transformer. You can't just assume because there's a breach, it's the worst possible thing will happen. It's certainly possible that a bunch of data will be exposed or you'll be held up for ransom, and all those things can happen and we see them happen, but every breach doesn't lead to those. One thing though that is quite different about these kinds of attacks is that once the attack vector becomes known, and again, this is both for physical or cybersecurity risks, like once somebody manages to make some breach, then that information becomes available to a whole bunch of people, and that makes the probability of people succeeding in those become much higher. In terms of, I mentioned this briefly in the first part, in terms of extreme weather events, I think we have to recognize that under climate change, we can be exposed to more of such events. So floods, cold weather, high winds, the frequency of these events might be changing. And so I think if we're dealing with risks brought on by those kind of events, it really is prudent to do different scenario analysis. And again, especially this is if we're talking about you know, doing predictions over 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. When you start looking at these longer timeframes, I think you have to consider the possibility of climate change and consider that under different scenarios. You know, it's like a 1.5 degree increase or a 3 degree increase. Those kinds of scenarios have to be considered as part of your risk evaluation. And again, under things not under your control necessarily as an asset owner are are market changes. So if there are going to be changes in demand for your output, if you're providing some commodity and demand for that potentially significantly increases or decreases, that can affect the consequence of failures. So if there's way more demand for a commodity and there's an outage of that commodity, that becomes much more costly and expensive. And in fact, even increases in demand can impact probabilities and add additional failure modes because of increased usage of assets can lead to increased failures. So this is a completely different kind of risk in the sense that, so we model asset risk because we want to understand what risks we need to mitigate. And then once we decide to mitigate a risk, we create projects to mitigate those risks. But creation of those projects actually creates new risks associated with the execution of those projects. And one of the, obviously one of the most common things are project delays, project cost overruns. And so while it's impossible to understand what's with respect to delays and overruns, it's impossible to predict for a single project what's going to happen. You can predict in aggregate for a portfolio of projects what's going to happen. And then this graph shows such a prediction. So the green line here shows an original prediction. So, or in a sense, the plan. We have a portfolio of projects. We've decided this is the plan we want to go ahead with, and here is the total cost of all those projects. But we know from looking at similar projects and a historical analysis of these projects that stuff always happens. We can't find the people we need to execute the projects. We don't get the permits in time. Things prove more difficult than expected. There's scope changes to projects. And as a result of that, we can put uncertainty around each individual project, and then we can do simulations with that uncertainty to understand in aggregate what will happen to the portfolio. And so the blue line then represents the expected actual spend. And this example is spend, but it also could be how much risk you're going to mitigate, or any other thing you're trying to accomplish with your projects. And in addition, the blue line is showing us the expected value, and the gray bands are showing us the uncertainty. And so this gives us a way to understand and give stakeholders a way to understand in aggregate what's likely to happen with a portfolio, so they can make contingency plans accordingly. So in this particular example, you can see that very likely you can expect that you'll be underspending in the first couple of years and then overspending in the outer years. So I'm going to jump to monetizing risk. And in order to understand whether or not it's worthwhile to mitigate a risk, we have to understand the value of the risk we're mitigating. And to do that, we need to quantify safety, reliability, environmental risks. Because if we don't do that, like if we just stick to if we just have, a score from 1 to 5 for each of our risks, we don't know the relative importance of those risks to each other unless they've all been calibrated against each other. And we don't really know how much is worthwhile to invest to mitigate those. So we need a common scale for measuring risks. And we've found the simplest scale is to use a monetary one. So let's talk about those. So starting with, perhaps one of the ones that's most sensitive is safety. So, everyone wants to make things as safe as possible, but we all operate in industries where there are inherently dangers, and it's impossible to completely eliminate all the risk. So while safety might be very important, you're never going to be able to spend enough money and enough resources to mitigate every single risk. So how much value do you put on mitigating risks that could lead to fatalities? So helpfully, the US Department of Transportation actually publishes a value. And this is a value that they use to tell people how much they should spend on, this is particular for highways, but how much should you spend to correct an issue if you can prevent loss of life by correcting that issue. And the latest value they have is $11.6 million. Now, and there's a reference here if you want to look it up. This is all publicly available data. Now, as an organization, you might choose a number that's smaller or larger. I've seen organizations go, well, they use that, we'll double it or we'll quadruple it. And I think that's all fine. And that's what we talk about, creating a value framework for your organization. I think the critical thing is that everyone in your organization uses the same value, and that it's a value that everyone agrees upon. Otherwise, you've got some people, putting forward investments based on, just basically very different parameters than other people. And if one person thinks, a life's only worth $1 million, and someone else thinks it's $100 million, then that won't result in a consistent assessment across your organization, and it will essentially result in poor decisions. So moving from safety to service levels. So service levels is probably a little easier than safety. But I want to talk about what we call actual costs versus societal costs, because you can choose to be concerned with one or the other. But again, you should decide as an organization what you're concerned about, because they are very different numbers. So if I fail to provide a service to my clients or customers, there's two ways I can look at it. I can look at it as what we're calling the actual cost. So that's what the client isn't going to pay me. So I was going to provide a service. They were paying me, $3 per widget. I don't provide 10 widgets. That costs me, so that's $30 I won't get. But there's a much broader cost in that if I failed to provide something to that client, it's likely going to cost them way more than just what they were paying me. And using electrical distribution as an example, if we're talking about a utility providing electricity to a small commercial business, and there's a 1-hour outage, the client's probably paying something like 10 cents per kilowatt hour for that power. But the cost to those clients of being out for an hour is much, much higher than that. And there's a study here, again, it's publicly available, you can look it up, but for a 1-hour outage, it's costing them $300 per unserved kilowatt hours, because during that time, they're unable to do their business, they're unable to serve their clients. So you can see these numbers can be vastly different. So you do have to decide what you're going to consider for what we call, for any service level or reliability risk. What cost are you going to use to evaluate that? Environmental costs. So, I think over the last 10 years, there's been I assume everyone's familiar with putting carbon pricing on carbon emissions or carbon equivalent emissions, and again, there are though very different numbers out there, and as an organization, you have to decide what price your organization wants to use. Also, though, if we're not talking about emissions, we're talking about environmental damage, you typically are estimating those risks based on either, well, likely a combination of either penalties or the cost to mitigate that or restore the environment to the condition before the incident occurred. And I'd say the one that potentially found the hardest to put some quantitative value on is reputational damage to an organization. And where this comes up most frequently, at least in risks I've seen, is where like an organization has committed to doing certain things, or and what's going to happen to the reputation of that organization if they fail to do that. And that's, to date, the best way I've found to do this is similar to talking to clients about their willingness to pay for better service. It's to kind of ask yourself as an organization, well, how much would we have to pay, or how much would we have to spend to restore the goodwill that such an event would cost us? And again, you're not going to get this accurate to 3 significant digits, but often and usually it's pretty easy for people to agree on the order of magnitude of such things. So just before I turn it over to questions, I'll leave it with my final thought, that if you're going to leave this webinar with one thing, it's that risk is the product of consequence and likelihood, but it needs to be the consequence and likelihood of the same event. So while this industrious beaver might dig through a conduit and might cause a 36-hour outage and your internet might be lost, but just because you see this beaver doesn't mean the internet's about to go out. So I guess with that, I'll turn it over to questions.
Excellent, Stan. All right, so we have a few minutes. We also have a ton of questions. Some of them, of course, were coming in before you addressed particular topics. So now I'm stuck here with the task of trying to rummage through them and figure out which ones you haven't yet answered. One which stands out is the risk of technological obsolescence. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a whole category. So again, it's the same underlying methodology. You have to think, okay, if there's technological obsolescence, what does that actually mean? What's going to happen if this device isn't supported by the supplier anymore? And that can be an easy question or a difficult question, but you have to ask yourself, what's the consequence of it being obsolete? Like, what does that mean? What's going to happen? Does that mean it's going to fail? Does that mean if it does fail, it'll take longer to repair? And so sometimes it's easy, even though something's obsolete, it's easy to hold spares for it and continue to use it. Sometimes it might be impossible because of big security risks. So yeah, that's kind of a whole category in itself, but the methodology remains the same. You've got to think about what's going to happen if I keep operating this obsolete equipment.
There's a few questions which are all tied together in a way around intangible stuff, right? Intangible risks. And you mentioned them briefly, I guess, with your reputation comment there at the end. But more broadly, like, how do you actually deal with intangible risks or intangible consequences to risks, I should say? I guess.
Intangible consequences. We make every effort to make them tangible. It's the only answer I have to that. Is we make every attempt to ask ourselves, because the fact, like when you say intangibles, it means, at least my understanding, the definition is, okay, so there's something there, but we don't quite know how much it's worth. And what we're trying to do is at least, they said, at least put an order of magnitude on how much that's worth. And I think, again, it's less about getting that exactly right and more about an organization agreeing on that consistent level. And that way, you know, if it's coming out wrong, everyone can say, oh, okay, well, we're putting too much value on that. We should all collectively lower that. But if you've got some people putting a really high value on it and some people putting a really low value on it, then you can't make sense of any results or comparisons.
Correct. Here's another good one, and that is tied into, you mentioned historical data at the very beginning. So what happens if there's no historical data? So for example, thinking of overpressurization of a line, I assume it's a gas line, no historical data available, very low probability, but very high consequences.
So overpressurization of a line, there's no data. I think what we make sure you do, so there are, you know, there are risks out there that have never happened, and you have to put a probability on them. What we make sure you do is you don't put an unrealistic probability on it, if that makes sense. Like if you know that this hasn't happened in the last 100 years, you better make sure your probability you're putting on it is less than that. Like if there's a million of these, just make the number simple, there's a million of these assets and that it hasn't happened in 100 years on any of those assets, well, you know the probability is less than 1 in 100 million. And so you can push it that high. But so just make, but yeah, there are events we have to consider where we don't, they've never happened and we hope they will never ever happen. But so you do have to estimate some probability without historical data, but just don't make it ridiculously large.
Is this an area where digital twins and other modeling techniques might help?
I think so. I mean, yeah, I mean, you could definitely see using simulations to predict the likelihood of such events. I mean, in a way, you could think of all climate modeling as a digital twin for the climate, right? And that's exactly what it does. It says, well, here's a 1 in whatever chance that this event, which we've never seen happen, will happen, right? That this ground will get flooded with this probability over the next 30 years. So yeah, absolutely.
We're clearly not going to get to the end of all our questions. I'm going to ask you one last one here, and that is, with all the different types of risk associated with assets like health, safety, you know, social, reputation, etc., how do you develop an overall risk score?
So you basically add all the risks together, and that's why we advocate for monetizing all these risks, so you can add them together. So if you can monetize your safety risk and it's $15 and your reliability risk is $32, your total risk is $47. And this is why if you don't do that, if you don't put them on some common scale, you can't add them together. And so that's why we say you kind of have to, well, if you want to add them together, you have to put them on a common scale.
Yeah. Well, we're at the hour. Tom, do you have any last questions for Stan, just to round it up? And you
actually, I have a question for both of you. The consequences side of the risk, in particular, requires some engagement on the part of the customer. How do you get your the people sponsoring the modeling engaged in building the models? What's your strategy for that?
Involves, when you say the customer, are you talking about like our customer?
Yeah,
or
the person, yeah, the utility or entity buying your model. What's their role in building the model?
Oh, it's essential and integrated and part of our implementation. I mean, we work almost always with dozens or more people in each organization to talk to them about these questions around how important is this to you? How valuable is this to you? Yeah, and it's quite enlightening for the organization, because it causes them to think about, you know, how important are all these things to us.
Okay, good.
Exactly.
Thank you.
All right, well, we're way over time. Stan, do you want to click one more slide?
Sorry.
There you go. So I'd like to thank you, Stan, for this this kind of great topic, great discussion. We could have gone on for another hour, I'm sure. Maybe we'll have to at some point. Because indeed, we're always interested in hearing about new ideas for next webinars. So any of you in the audience, please feel free to email either of us, Tom or myself, with any ideas that you have. Either questions about stuff that we should be covering, or suggestions for speakers, of course. And then for the IAM in general, don't forget that the UK conference of the IAM will be happening in about 4 weeks' time. That there is a webinar of the Women in Asset Management North America just after that on June 17th. The North American conference for the IAM, which is jointly organized by Canada and the US, this year will be again virtual or online. It'll be from October 12th to 14. We are looking for volunteers to help us organize that event. So if you're interested, again, please email us. There is a fair number of other branch events, both in the US and in Canada, which are listed on the IAM website. Don't forget to visit on a regular occasion, because things keep adding to the list. And in particular, for you Canadians, the AGM, the annual AGM of the Canadian chapter, will be on July 14th. So you can pin that one down in your diary too. You can come and vote for the future of IAM Canada. So with that, thank you very much to Tom, to Stan, of course. And I hope to see you soon again, and hopefully in person. Stay safe.
Thank you.